Welcome, everybody. My name is Irina Sarek. I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor. And so I'm joining you from today, the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. So welcome. This webinar is a project of the Infrastructure Beyond Extractivism project, which all of us on this webinar are part of. For more information about that project, I would really urge you to check out our website, which you probably saw when you signed up, but it's jurisdiction-infrastructure.com. That's jurisdiction-infrastructure.com. We also have a mailing list that you can sign up for to find out about other events like this one and the work that various members of the project are doing. So as you probably know, this panel draws together scholars from a number of academic areas, including law, geography, and anthropology, with community partners and land-based practitioners, all of whom are working to restore Indigenous jurisdiction in the midst of a climate crisis, and who are really sort of reimagining and rethinking what critical infrastructure is along the way. So I'm going to introduce each speaker or pair of speakers just before they present. We'll hear from each of our panelists, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. The Q&A function is turned on, so you may have to press the more that you see at the bottom of your screen with three dots to have Q&A show up, or it may just be at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you can enter any questions or comments you have for the panel as a whole or for particular speakers. We are going to start off with two co-presenters, Emma Feltus and Jocelyn Stacey. Emma Feltus is an outgoing assistant professor of anthropology at York and an incoming assistant professor of socio-legal studies at the University of Toronto. She's a legal and political anthropologist whose work examines the structure and the operation of Canadian colonialism, with a focus on constitutional law, international law, and transnational decolonization and climate justice. A settler scholar, writer, and anti-colonial activist, Emma draws on more than a decade working in alliance with Indigenous peoples in interior BC, including an ongoing collaboration with the Chilcotin National Government, investigating and advancing Indigenous jurisdiction through the climate crisis. Jocelyn Stacey is an associate professor at the Allard School of Law at UBC. She researches environmental crises and the visible and invisible ways in which law creates, regulates, and prevents these events. Her work focuses on environmental assessment law, disaster law, climate change, emergency powers, and the rule of law. Jocelyn works closely with First Nations on legal issues related to disasters, emergency powers, and Indigenous jurisdiction, and she's also the president of the Pacific Center for Environmental Law and Litigation, a nonprofit society dedicated to training law students and young lawyers in public interest and environmental law litigation. And their presentation is called Right to Burn: Indigenous Rights and Jurisdiction in a Country on Fire. Take it away.
Okay, I'm just sharing my screen. Can I get a thumbs up to know? Okay, great. So thank you so much, Irina, for kicking us off and for your opening and for introducing us as well. As mentioned, I'm Emma Feltus, and soon to be assistant professor at the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. And today, Jocelyn and I will be speaking together about an ongoing collaborative research project on fire stewardship, and how the Tsilhqot'in Nation is bringing fire back to their territory through the exercise of their inherent laws and jurisdiction. And as we'll explain in a moment, we've been asked to bring this work into conversation with Canadian law. So that's what we'll kind of be talking about today. And the central question that we're investigating on that is whether jurisdiction can fit within an Aboriginal right under Section 35 of the Constitution, or kind of to put it another way, how the interpretation of Section 35 might need to evolve in order to recognize and support the exercise of Indigenous jurisdiction. So a little bit of an outline. First, we'll kind of set the stage and talk a little bit about how we've come to do this work. So I'll hand it over to Jocelyn in a moment to do that. Then we're going to talk a bit about Section 35 as it is now and the current limits that it presents in terms of how it might apply to exercising a right to burn. And then finally, we're going to talk about recent shifts in case law and whether these hold any kind of promise or glimmers of hope for fire stewardship. And so I'll hand it over to Jocelyn now.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Irina. It's really nice to be here with you all today. I'm joining folks from the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people out at the UBC Vancouver campus, lands on which I'm very grateful, though uninvited guest. But I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to present some ongoing work with Emma and to be able to start by sharing with you a brief version of the story that brought Emma and I into conversation and collaboration with the Tsilhqot'in Nation back in 2017. So let me just give you a sense of that backdrop before we get into the legal analysis that we're now engaged in. As many folks will know, the Tsilhqot'in Nation has a unique status in Canadian law. It's the First Nation to have successfully proven Aboriginal title in the Canadian courts with the 2014 Supreme Court of Canada title declaration. And so as a result, the Tsilhqot'in Nation is in a position to exercise their rights, laws, and jurisdiction in relation to the Canadian state in a way that's distinct from most Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, despite this distinctive status in Canadian law, jurisdictional issues about the exercise of Tsilhqot'in law and governance persist across the whole of their territory, including the declared title area. So the 2017 wildfires, we think, are a very dramatic example of the challenges that the nation has faced. For folks outside of BC, maybe you have some vague recollection of this. I mean, it was very dramatic here in BC when it happened back in 2017. These were then record-breaking wildfires, the first of a few years in a row of record-breaking wildfires, which scorched Tsilhqot'in territory right up to the doorsteps of 3 of 6 of the Tsilhqot'in communities. In the midst of those fires, the RCMP showed up in one of the communities attempting to enforce a provincial evacuation order. And when the chief of the community refused to sign off on that provincial evacuation order, the RCMP responded with threats to apprehend their kids. Now, the chief refused to sign off on that. They already had their emergency measures in place, and yet were faced with such a deeply colonial threat. That conflict de-escalated, but the provincial wildfire response continued to unfold in a way that erased and marginalized First Nations and their own responses to that wildfire. And so after that event, Emma and I were invited by the nation to support their documentation of Tsilhqot'in experiences during the wildfire and to document in particular the gaps, the conflicts, the confusion, the coordination challenges with respect to jurisdiction. Those findings were published by the nation in the Fires Awakened Us report in 2019, and we've worked with the nation since then. And in fact, we've co-authored 2 additional reports with them on subsequent emergencies that have since occurred. One of the themes that we heard when we were doing that work for the Fires Awakened Us report was how badly the lands have been mismanaged by the province. We heard about many places in Tsilhqot'in territory that folks knew were an extreme fire risk. And so one of the calls that came out from that work reported in the Fires Awakened Us was for the Tsilhqot'in to lead wildfire mitigation efforts through preventative burning. And a year after those 2017 wildfires, 2 of the communities, Unesitine and Honeyguatine, began fire stewardship programs led by former Unesitine chief Russell Myers Ross in partnership with a nonprofit organization called Gathering Voices Society. And they've revived the practice of burning the land, or what some people call cultural burning. The purpose, according to Tsilhqot'in knowledge, is not just wildfire prevention, although that is one benefit, but to activate the landscape. This is fire stewardship. Like, it's at the center of caring for the land as a whole, for caring for plants, for wildlife, for each other. Unesitine's been running its fire stewardship program for 7 years now. And one of the things that they're doing that's really cool is that they've got all of these overlapping research projects to document and support the work. So projects on carbon management, tracking the return of wildlife, mental health impacts on fire practitioners. And so they're sort of using research to build the case for what they know is the right relationship with their land and with each other. And so Emma and I have been brought into that work. 2 years ago, Russ asked us to join this constellation of research projects, specifically, as Emma mentioned, to explore the question of whether the right to burn could be constitutionally protected as a Section 35 right, and then more broadly to explore legal avenues for gaining access to land to restore Tsilhqot'in fire stewardship across traditional territory. So let's turn to that right to burn analysis. Emma?
Thanks. Yeah. So when Jocelyn and I were given this task to kind of make the case for not just a right to burn, but a right to fire stewardship, we had some reservations. As many in this room know, Section 35 can be a pretty blunt tool, but especially blunt when it comes to questions of governance and jurisdiction. John Burroughs has chalked this up to the perceived threat that Indigenous self-government poses to Canada's territorial integrity. And I think the connection that he makes there between land and jurisdiction is an important one, but one that I'm actually going to bracket for now. And actually, I'm going to bracket the fact that the Tsilhqot'in have title altogether. What I want to focus on today is not actually the connection between land and jurisdiction, but more the connection between jurisdiction and law. And Shiri Pasternak, who I think is here, has put it so eloquently in her work, the way that jurisdiction is an expression of law, but also an expression of the very power to speak the law. It carries with it legal systems, and in this case, Indigenous legal systems. And so to ask then whether fired stewardship could be considered a constitutional right kind of gestures to a question that Gordon Christie asked in a paper that he wrote in 2007, where he wrote, how are we to imagine an entire legal system being fit within a sort of right? And so the premise of our presentation today is really a kind of riff on that question. How can jurisdiction fit within a right? And the current legal test for proving the existence of a Section 35 Aboriginal right in Canadian law, the Vanderpeet test, has been kind of famously insufficient on questions of jurisdiction and self-governance. And this comes down to the very way that the test defines the nature of rights as, quote, a practice, custom, or tradition integral to the distinctive culture of the Aboriginal group. And of course, much critique has focused on that part about rights being integral to a distinctive culture. And so coming back again to Burroughs, he spells out how this kind of relegates Indigenous peoples to some immutable but mythically questionable past. But here I want to focus on the other part of the test that limits the scope of rights to practices, customs, and traditions. And this is the part that I think allows the courts to kind of shrink rights down to their smallest irreducible unit, a singular specific activity that individuals go out and do, usually a resource harvesting activity. And this is the part of the test that makes it so that you can get an Aboriginal right to fish, but not a right to manage the fishery according to your own political and legal systems, kind of a right to do a thing, but not the decision-making authority over that thing. And for this, I think the 1996 case, Bamajaman, is most exemplary, where two Anishinaabe bands tried to put the right of self-government before the courts, specifically their right to regulate high-stakes gambling. But the courts instead applied the Vanderpeet test to the activity of gambling, kind of shrinking it again to its smallest unit, the activity over which jurisdiction was being exercised, but avoiding what it deemed to be, and this is a quote from the decision, the excessive generality of a broad right to manage the use of their reserve lands. And so how does this result relate to what we're talking about, fire stewardship? So we have been hearing murmurs from BC Wildfire, from the province, that they are moving in the direction of treating cultural burning as an Aboriginal right. But what's interesting is that even though cultural burning isn't a proven Section 35 right, and even though, we hear these rumors, but provincial policy hasn't explicitly moved to a rights-based model, we have already witnessed the same limitations that are kind of ingrained in Section 35 being applied to cultural burning through observing the barriers that Silcotin fire stewardship programs have faced these last few years. So cultural burning has similarly been kind of reduced to the specific activity, the actual act and instance of going out and burning the land, kind of divorced from the jurisdictional practice of fire stewardship. And so this way it can be kind of slotted into provincial policy, where the only explicitly stated aim is preventing wildfire in order to conserve timber supply and good jobs in the logging sector. So this is pretty classic colonial rhetoric around preserving, quote unquote, critical infrastructure when in effect, they're saving trees only to log them. But the other thing is when the only aim is wildfire prevention, this actually changes the very method by which you do it. Burning hot and fast, lighting with drip torches, and then putting out fires with hoses. Whereas, as Jocelyn mentioned earlier, the aim and responsibility of Silcotin fire stewardship is more than just wildfire prevention, but also bringing biodiversity back, helping things to grow again. And the method for doing this, which we have now experienced over the last 2 years participating in these burns, is through burning slow and cool, letting fire kind of follow its own path and go out on its own. So even the cultural practice is sort of compromised as soon as it's plucked from its legal and jurisdictional context. So if we were to imagine a right to jurisdiction being more than just a right to administer programs and services in a way circumscribed by provincial policy or by the colonial state, but as an expression of Indigenous legal orders, I think this brings us back to Gordon Christie's question, whether Indigenous law can fit within a right. And interestingly, the courts themselves are starting to broach this question, kind of almost 30 years after Pamajuan. And so now, having laid out some of the ways that the current framework for Section 35 sucks, I'll hand it over to Jocelyn to talk about some of those glimmers and shifts and where they may find some promise for fire stewardship.
Okay, Irina, I promise we are going to wrap this up close to on time here. So I just want to say a little bit about those shifts that may be emerging in Section 35 jurisprudence, as well as why we think that fire stewardship, is a good case for sort of testing some of these boundaries a little bit further. And so first on sort of the changes or the potential changes that we're seeing take place with Section 35, I'm echoing here what others, Naomi Metallic, Josh Nichols, have written about with these recent legal developments. But really, there's sort of two shifts that we're seeing in the legal context. One is Canada's commitment to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So as many of you know, Canada removed its objector status in 2016. Both BC and Canada have legislation in place committing to aligning their laws with the declaration. And those changes provide a legal rationale for the courts, should they want to take it, for making substantive changes to constitutional law in Canada. The second shift in the legal change in the legal context is that Canadian courts can no longer deny the existence and relevance of Indigenous laws as laws. I don't want to overstate this. We're not saying that Canadian judges have expertise with Indigenous law or that they do the right thing when confronted with Indigenous laws, simply that we're at a point where judges are now regularly exposed to Indigenous laws and are sort of forced to have to engage with them as such. And there's two cases where we see this changed legal context having some effect, two notable cases that others have written about, and we're going to draw on their work. So the first is the 2024 Supreme Court of Canada reference decision that upheld as constitutional federal legislation recognizing Indigenous jurisdiction over children and families. This was a very narrow ruling, but one in which a unanimous Supreme Court of Canada held that the UN Declaration has been incorporated into Canadian domestic law, and in which the court describes braiding laws as a legal methodology. Braiding laws as in bringing together Indigenous, Canadian, and international law sort of as equals, right? A legal methodology that's been, put forward by Indigenous scholars and lawyers for years. And so while it wasn't a case about, ended up not being a case about Section 35, we do have a unanimous Supreme Court of Canada judgment engaging with Indigenous self-government, Indigenous jurisdiction, and Indigenous laws, endorsing this approach of braiding. The other case that folks may be familiar with is White and Montour, a 2023 Quebec Superior Court decision in which a novel Aboriginal rights claim was advanced as a defense to criminal charges. In this case, the court directly addressed the limits of Section 35 case law that Emma mentioned. And it held that the current test, that Vanderpeet test under Section 35, does not conform with the UN Declaration. The trial court ditched that test, offered a new three-part test for proving Aboriginal rights. And the second step in that test would require proof that a claimed right is protected by the traditional legal system. So here we have a thoughtful attempt at answering Gordon Christie's query, a test for Aboriginal rights that's grounded in the collective rights and legal systems of Indigenous peoples. So let me just end by saying a couple of things about why we think fire stewardship is a good place to test test sort of how far the courts are willing to go in terms of these developments. We're sort of inspired. We're inspired by the words of Minnie Charlie Boy, a Tsilhqot'in elder, who, in speaking about fire, says, anything, if you want it to regrow, you have to burn it, and then it'll regrow again. So we're with the Montour, the judge in the Montour case. It's time to burn the current Section 35 test for proving Aboriginal rights and let something else come up in its wake. We've got these changes that are emerging in Canadian law. We've got a changing political context here in BC about the widespread recognition to change our relationship with fire. We've got an incredible groundwork that's been laid by the Tsilhqot'in Nation through the title litigation, including oral history on fire, as well as a trial court judgment that, makes findings about the province's mismanagement of the forest in ways that have harmed that rights and title. And we think there's a remarkable set of features about fire, too, that allow a rights claim to resist being lumped into the Vanderpeet era cases that Emma mentioned. Features about fire that I think mean that it sort of has to be understood more closely connected to the laws, the Indigenous laws that govern it. So I'll leave it at that. We're 7 years into this work in UNESITIN, and they've got such an incredible track record to show what the future of fire and the future of Section 35 could look like. So we're really happy to take questions or hear your thoughts when we get to that part of the panel. Thanks for letting us share our work.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn and Emma. I feel like that was like I want to hold up the fire emoji to comment on, especially the with respect to Section 35 at the end. Amazing. I had Rob going second, but I noticed that you're in a vehicle and you may not have the best availability. So if you wanted to go next, I know Rob would be fine with that. You're still muted.
Oh, is it 15 minutes? I would like to hear what Rob has to say because I
Okay.
do have a half an hour if he has 15 and then I have 15. I would like to hear what he has to say before I speak, but if not, I could go too.
No, I think he was ready to go second,
Okay,
so
okay.
we'll tee him up.
Okay.
Rob Clifford is a Saanich and a member of the Tsawut First Nation on Vancouver Island. He is an assistant professor at Allard at UBC, where he is co-director of Indigenous legal studies. His work engages a resurgence of Saanich laws within the context of colonialism and climate crisis, and seeks to relate the ways those laws reflect and generate out of the values, philosophies, lands, and worldviews of his people.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm also looking forward to what I'm going to say. We'll see what happens here. So, yeah, I don't know yet, but I'm going to I actually have PowerPoints, which is like once in a lifetime for me. So you're lucky in that way. Sorry if you hear cats fighting in the background also. That everyone can see that. This is all working fine. So yeah, well, it's great to Lahela. Osiam Checha. As mentioned, my name is Rob Clifford. I also carry the name Yolquetza from my late grandfather, Earl Claxton Sr. Um, Joining from Seout today. Just yeah, here at home, as you mentioned, like cats in the background and other sorts of things. So yeah, happy to be joining and to chat about this paper that is brand new, as in 0 words written so far, but some sort of idea that has been kind of taking shape a little bit more law-like, I suppose, than a lot of things that I do, or it's a bit more thinking through some kind of different matters about land back and how that looks different in different contexts. So, I mean, I suppose the first thing to put up here is this. My grandfather and my uncle Sinkton worked on this book that I have the picture, the cover of there about our 13 moons, our governance cycle that brings us through our territory according to the cycle of the seasons, to different places and relationship with different places and beings throughout Saanich territory, through the different moon cycles. So I won't, given 15 minutes is short, I won't get into the kind of deep importance of place in the way that I think about percentage law, percentage governance, and the way that place is not place in an abstract, but the very particulars of each place, and the way in which we relate to those places. So, I mean, I guess one of the spots where I thought I would start off is, I mean, for a long time now, we've had this goal of land back, or we have this Saanich Indian Territorial Declaration here from 1987. Obviously, it goes long before that as well, in terms of resistance to or um, a refusal of the various types of dispossession that have happened throughout Saanich territory. Obviously, being close to Fort Victoria and what is now Victoria, there's a lot of fee simple ownership and other sorts of private property and parks and all sorts of different ways in which our territory has been dispossessed over the years. And this is one statement that was made by some of our leaders back when I was young that talks about that dispossession and how we've never agreed to it, but also ending with this statement here that because this territorial title cannot be bought or sold, we therefore declare in our final words that our Saanich territorial homeland inherent rights are not for sale, which we'll come back to, right? Because some of the ways in which um, land has come back has been because people have bought it back, or that's kind of one of the things been bought and sold, and there's all kinds of different complexities that we might get into. But with that declaration, we had this map. I know it's really zoomed out, but it's just we can zoom in later. It's just a map of all of our different Sinchothan place names for the our territory and for the places in which we visited, right? So um, the Saanich Peninsula here. It's kind of the heart of our homeland, down to our Lekwungen neighbors and our Cowichan neighbors to the west, and over across stateside to our Lummi relatives, and over to Point Roberts, Boundary Bay, and Musqueam and whatnot. But so kind of in throughout all of this different territory, all the different names and creation stories and relationships that we have with places. So it would be way too big of a project right now to dive into all of the different ways that all of those different places in some way have been affected by dispossession or different sort of jurisdictional entanglements, I suppose. But that would take too much, but we could start to zoom in a little bit to think of some specific examples. So I've circled this little island in red out here called Sisquanam, which is just off of I'm using my cursor, like you can see the cursor. I don't know if you can, but so I'm in here, Sandston Bay, and here at Sayout, right? So across James Island and Sydney Island over to Seasquanum is um, a little island, and we could start to think about some of the land back initiatives, right? So how those were dispossessed, how it is they got to their certain state that they're at now, or how they're held and so forth, influences not only how they come back, but also what types of things they're entangled in when they come back and what you might be able to do with them when they come back. So it really it's not a straightforward question. It's always different in different contexts. So the goal with this paper was to try and zoom in and look at some of those examples, primarily through Saanich, but maybe elsewhere as well, and in a way that might be helpful. Helpful for Saanich because it's always our goal to have more land back. But also that we're at a point now where, believe it or not, you also need to think a little bit strategically about how land comes back, given limited capacity, funds, sometimes potential exposure to significant liabilities, and other sorts of things like that, that it just doesn't come back in some straightforward way. So try and think through all of those different examples. And I guess just as a final note, I'm not going to really talk about Aboriginal title as a way of land back. We know a fair amount about that already. So it's worth minus maybe what the Haida agreement looks like or will be, but kind of bracket that. And I'm also not going to really talk about legal personhood in this one, bracketing that as well, because sort of a different project all on its own, and it's land coming back to itself and then some form of co-governance. So I'm not really talking about co-governance here either. But it's this island here, Seasquanum, that had me first starting to kind of think about this a couple years back. Um, so this is the island here. This is Seasquanum, or some people call it Halibut Island. Small 9.67 acre island. It was privately owned before it went up for sale, and the Land Conservancy of British Columbia raised some funds, and we're going to buy this island for conservation purposes. So more on that in a minute, but they purchased the island for 1.55 million, and it was Dr. Tara Martin, who some at UBC might know. She's in the Faculty of Forestry. She sort of was leading and urged the Land Conservancy to not just purchase it back for conservation, but to think about partnering and returning it to Saanich. So um, there is a partnership, and it did come back to Saanich, but the island in itself is quite rare in that there's never been any infrastructure built on it. It's remained untouched, I suppose, and that's just been kind of in its natural state or what have you with native plants throughout it. So they were interested in buying it for conservation purposes, obviously, is why the Land Conservancy was involved. And so when they went to return it to Saanich, it was on various conditions, right? So one, that we create and enter into this restrictive environmental covenant to make sure it would stay in this natural state, and some form of co-management agreement, right? So um, obviously, there's happy to have the island back, but there's some level of kind of paternalistic type things as though we weren't the ones going around destroying all the rest of the islands. And it's not as though we didn't have and don't continue to have our own laws and ways for caring for these islands. So trying to fit our Saanich laws, values, and objectives into these little, any of those who have dealt with environmental covenants, or these little kind of like cookie cutter things that you need to deal with that don't really create much space for innovation, I suppose, right? So trying to think about how it is that this island has come back, but yet we still are entangled in these things. So that's where I first started thinking about it. When that happened, uh, they partnered with the Saanich Leadership Society, which is meant to represent all the percentage bands. They had to scramble for a way to even be able to hold this land when it comes back. So they created this percentage lands trust society on very tight timelines, to be able to hold it. They're a not-for-profit society with their powers delegated to them from the bands, although they try and work beyond band councils, and to uphold their own mandate and objectives, which is furthering percentage resurgence and governance and all of these sorts of things. So um, that's continued to grow that land trust society because since then there's been other land back thing initiatives. So there was Sequel or Maber Flats, a 45.7 acre piece of land that this family had farmed for quite a long time in Saanich, and they were kind of sick of farming it because it's actually a wetland and having to divert water and to farm it was just a big pain, and they were trying to get rid of it. But we sort of got it because they essentially wanted to spite the CRD and didn't want to. Yeah, anyways, it came back through this ecological gifts program. So it was the very first time that that had ever happened where someone used the ecological gifts program and they get all kinds of tax benefits and things, gifted the land to Saanich, which was held by the Trust Society. But in order for that to happen, then all of a sudden the Land Trust Society for Saanich had to meet various, it had to be accredited essentially to be able to do that. So to look, operate, and to uphold various best practices, it had to ensure that the land was in a natural state, either maintained or returned to, or else they'd be on the hook for the price of the land, which is millions and millions of dollars, right? So it's a bit of a risky venture in that you might be on the hook for money that you just don't have. But that's sort of the way you had to go through to get this land back. The goal is to return it to wetlands, which is what SECO wants to be, and so that's still in the process. There are other societies doing similar sorts of things. It's not as though there's just one land trust society in Saanich. So I am running out of time very quickly. There's also, we know about the brilliant work that Tiffany Joseph is doing with the Rematriate and the Hachatenu Sacred Land Society, um, looking to buy and do it more of a grassroots. I'm going to go very, very fast now so that we can get there because there's other examples. But holding land for a safe place for Coast Salish caretakers to live and to um, restore land and so forth. There's also Sayout buying various examples of bands buying land. So recently just bought this land near Sayout, um, um, Puckle Farm. They're going to try and buy it. They're holding it in a land trust now with the intention to go through the additions to reserve process. There's other percentage bands who have bought this, again, moving very, very fast. Dunsmuir Lodge. So they partnered with this other group to buy this lodge where there's now mental health and addiction services up there. And then the Pakwachin owns the 72 acres of forest around it in trust on our sacred mountains. The idea is just to leave that to be never developed ever. So they keep holding it in trust. Sartlip First Nation bought this 78 hectares of farmland. Normally, you don't want to hold in trust or have land with infrastructure on it that needs extensive repairs like this one does because it creates, again, liability issues. So this land is just sat vacant while all of this tries to get fixed up. But the idea is to further food security and have this area of land next to the reserve serve that purpose. Pakwachin also has bought a couple golf courses, of all things. One in which they run as a golf course because many of these lands are in agricultural land reserve. There's no formal process to get it out of agricultural land reserve. Ardmore here is developed for the purposes in agricultural land reserve for the purposes of maintaining a golf course. So they keep running the golf course, this other golf course they bought, and it's just, as you can see, sat vacant while they try and do something else with it. But there's kind of limits to what you might be able to do. And then another one we're in the process of now is Altas or James Island, which is just kind of right there behind me, right? Trying to get that back either through Supreme Court claim or something else negotiated. But these things also create some division, right? Because Sayot First Nation pulled out of the Senate Leadership Council, and partly because who gets to own this island or who gets to take the lead on it creates all types of difficulties and challenges. So, yeah, I'm probably past my time, but I mean, the idea was to go through some different examples of um, land back is great in the goal, but it's also complicated and always looks different in different contexts, depending on how it was dispossessed, what you might be able to do or hope to do with it, and all the challenges and kind of internal things that that creates. So, um, that's the idea of this paper, I guess. So, Aishka.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was really inspiring to actually see all of the really concrete examples that you point to, and I'm sure we can chat about them later. Kanahus, how are you feeling about going next?
I'm good.
Okay, well, Kanahus Manuel is a land and water defender, a tattoo artist, and a traditional birth keeper belonging to the Secwepemc and Ktunaxa nations of the south central interior of so-called BC. She's also a member and founder of the Tiny House Warriors movement, and her talk today is building anti-colonial solidarity infrastructure networks. The floor is yours.
Waitkakwaiatup, Kanahus Bethki West. Hello, everybody. My name is Kanahus Bethki Manuel. My name means red woman in Tanaka. I was named by my father, Arthur Manuel's mother, Marceline Manuel, who's our Tanaka side of our family. Well, today I'm here at Lummi Nation, just on the water, and I spent the morning at Lummi Island at one of the reef net fishing sites, welcoming some canoes with Jewel James, one of the leaders here. I'm at the Vine Deloria Symposium here in Lummi Nation at the Northwest Indian College, but I'm from the Secwepemc Nation, where I live in the south central of so-called British Columbia, Canada. And our nation, Secwepemc Uluk, is 180,000 square kilometers of unceded, unsurrendered territory, one of the bigger nations in so-called BC. And my father, Arthur Manuel, he always said to just keep it really simple and keep it on land and self-determination. And so I try to keep that as my focus of my work, just to keep me grounded, that it could be a whole bunch of other issues that we're facing and bombarded with, like climate change and, overfishing and clear-cut logging, but it always brings us back to the land and self-determination of our people. Like the one of the declaration that Rob was talking about, we have some old declarations from our ancestors, including the Secwepemc Okanagan Declaration, that also states that we'll never cede or surrender our lands. And we stand on these older declarations of our ancestors because we need to make that our focus, that we'll never cede and surrender. And some of the newer self-government sellout deals that the government is pushing right now, and just the government of Canada using self-government and self-determination interchangeably, which is wrong. And these smaller self-government agreements that they're trying to get natives to sign on a band level is just like the BC Treaty process, which is an extinguishment process. And my family, as Indigenous rights leaders in the country, has never believed in any of these extinguishment processes. And so we stand on that as well. We also, take lead from Ross Daibo, because he's the one that's telling us what the government is trying to do right now. and stealing and thieving more of our land. So he's come to our community to really encourage our nation to develop self-determination plans. And like my father, Arthur Manuel, always said to us and his children was like, okay, they give you the land back tomorrow. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to manage it? What industries are you going to allow? Which ones are you not going to allow? So we start developing like land use policies, like, decades ago with grassroots community members like my Auntie Janice Billy and Don Morrison. And after the Delgamuukw decision in 1997, my father was Indian Affairs band chief, and he really was pushing the community to get off the reserve and start to assert our title and rights. That the government wasn't going to give it to us, that we had to actually assert it ourselves and get out there and exercise it. And especially the exclusive use and occupation of our land. So getting out on our territory, building homes and living out there on the land to challenge the Crown's jurisdiction and authority over our lands. And in 2001, that's what we did when we were combating the Sun Peak ski resort expansion in our moose hunting areas, was to build infrastructure, to build homes, to go out and begin to live on the territory. And we had the Squaquequel Protection Center and Native Youth Movement that built a cordwood house, which my sister lived in for not even 24 hours when the Crown hired Sun Peak's employees to bulldoze down the cordwood house, use Sun Peak's ski resort equipment to bulldoze the home right down to the ground. And threats of trespassing, threats of criminalization. We're very grassroots. After, when my father was Indian Affairs chief, and my grandfather and my uncle all participated in that system, but my dad said he'll never run for chief again, and he used his leadership in our community to continue to do the work under Indigenous Network on Economies and Trade, doing the international work and working with Russ Daibo as he did more of the domestic work in so-called Canada. But we have Secwepemc laws that are in existence. Even to this day, we still practice some of these Secwepemc laws, which include the protection of our territory and the responsibility that we have to our territory, to our salmon, to all living beings on our land. In Secwepemc Way, we have 4 chiefs. The chiefs are our food. We have the Spukbuk Ui, which is the berry. We have the Skeleton Ui, which is the salmon, and the Tsi, the chief of all the antler beings, and the Spitlam, the chief of the roots. And so we have responsibilities for that. We have still in existence today under the Secwepemc Okanagan Confederacy, our salmon chief, which ensures that there's no overharvesting of the salmon, where our nation holds one of the world's largest sockeye salmon spawning grounds in the Adams River. And so even within my generation, we've seen so much have changed, less and less salmon that are coming back. They said that our rivers and our creeks would be full of red because the salmon, they turn red as they come to spawn. But we're seeing that change. One of the ways that we've practiced our Secwepemc governance process is to host big nation assemblies, grassroots, not funded by the government, to bring our people together to discuss important issues pertaining to our land and our sovereignty, our self-determination. Before my father, Arthur Manuel, passed away, he called on the last one that we had, the Secwepemc Uluch, which is the Secwepemc Nation Assembly, and that was to discuss the Trans Mountain Pipeline, then called the Kinder Morgan Pipeline, and what that means. And so people have a place to gather to make decision about this, whether we would allow this pipeline to come through or not. And we passed the Secwepemc Uluk Declaration, saying absolutely no, we will not let this pipeline cross into our territory. And so and announced at that assembly that we would be building tiny houses to put in the path of the pipeline. And that's what we did. And we resisted this pipeline all throughout the construction and stage, all the way until now. We're still there resisting, where we have 7 tiny houses on wheels at Blue River, which is the center point in between the Edmonton terminal and the Tsleil-Waututh Marine Terminal. And we put them on wheels, these tiny homes, because we've built pit houses, we've built cordwood houses, we even built log cabins that were all destroyed by the government, by the crown and industry, and even white civilians, settler civilians. So we put them on wheels because one of the things that we were facing as we were going out and our exclusive use and occupation of our title lands was injunctions, court injunctions that the court would, or the companies would apply to the courts to get. And Trans Mountain was successful in getting a province-wide injunction. And so that was really hard for us to resist and do direct action while this province-wide injunction was there, including all their lease lands, all their property, all their everything. So a lot of criminalization happened. And but one things we did and we learned from the Sun Peaks fight was we weren't going to fall under this injunction charge because we wasted so much time and so much money fighting them and keeping our people out of jail and everything, and going through this court process, that we put our tiny houses on wheels. So if they came with an injunction and tried to remove us or use that as a reason to tear our houses down once again, we would just leave an inch out of these injunction zones and continue to resist and fight back for our land and our title and rights to our territory. And so we have 7 tiny houses on wheels. We want to build some more permanent infrastructure now, since this pipeline is now, flowing as of May 2024. Trans Mountain announced its 80% capacity flowing. And so we have to be really strategic too, because we didn't want to fall into these these injunction charges, which were landing people 30 days or more in jail, real jail time. But we are very vocal about that in the media. And so the Crown really pushing the police to act through their new division, the Community Industry Response Group, now called the Critical Response Unit, to throw every single criminal code charge they could on us, including trespassing, loitering even, assault and things. Meanwhile, our people are the ones that are getting assault, but we know the police switch it and then they'll charge us with assault. So yeah, we have to be really strategic in fighting for our land, especially when we're doing direct action to do so. And we have my twin sister right now serving a house arrest charge on a Scotland Indian Reserve, where she had got sentenced to 15 months in this house arrest. And so 8 months will be 24 hours a day, and then the next 7, and then her partner 8 months. The next is a curfew where they have to be inside from 6 a.m. or what is it, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then 200 hours of community work service, and after that 2 years probation. So it's pretty lengthy sentences. And we this criminalization, we're bringing citing this in submissions to the United Nations, the third submissions to push Canada to drop these charges, to push Canada and pressure them and bring attention to that we're still being criminalized here in so-called Canada. And so every time we go out onto the land, we're challenging the Crown's jurisdiction to our lands. And it's the most freeing feeling to leave the Indian Reserve. Like my father, he always told us 0.2%, 0.2%. You add up all the Indian reservations in Canada, it equals 0.2% of land, and we're going to remain poor on that 0.2%. And Canada has gotten very wealthy off of occupying and stealing the resources of the remaining 99.8% of our territories. And so by going out there and just living on the land and challenging that industry in Canada have any type of jurisdiction to our lands, one of the things that we do want to see is other people going out onto the lands and just occupying the lands without any fear of doing so. And it would be neat to see if like the Mohawk and the Mi'kmaq, Anishinaabe and the Cree and the Secwepemc, and we all went and start occupying and taking lands at the same time, how the government of Canada would respond. What happened, like Isaac Murdoch said, if 100 natives went and did it, across the country of Canada, it would overwhelm Canada, on how they would deal with us now, a new Indian problem. Now we're, actually taking our lands back by just the pure force of it. And interesting to see what ministries and what crown agencies would be the ones that would interfere with our assertion of title by exclusive use and occupation on the grounds, because we've had Ministry of Transportation interfere with us saying, hey, you're in our right of way. You got to move, 100 feet away from the road. We've had, other different ministries of coming and interfering, and we know they're all involved with the upper ups of the crown. And one thing that, one of our leaders, Sharon Ben, and leaders in the UN, she says we have to address the crown. Everyone wants to put it on the government of Canada and stuff, but it's still the crown that's interfering with our rights. They're still calling it crown land, like the land that we're on right now, they call it crown, the government calls it crown land. But we've been there for 7 years. And this year we're hoping to get like water, real water. Like we've been going down to Blue River to get water, or we've just been filling up water jugs to bring water into our home, our village site, because it's not just a camp anymore. We're calling this a tiny house warriors village. It's actually a village where we've been for 7 years. And we've had feasts and we continue to have gatherings. But as this pipeline is completed, what does that mean for the rest of the tar sands infrastructure, and how could we bring what we've learned from this pipeline fight, fighting these insurance companies, fighting, fighting these big banks to stop funding and financing these infrastructure projects, to move and start working with the next phase of this transportation infrastructure, which is the big super tankers coming and being filled right now, 890,000 barrels per day, filling big super tankers at the Tsleil-Waututh territory in the Westridge Marine Terminal. And so this will be the third year that we're helping to co-host the Salish Sea Assembly with our coastal relatives at Daybreak Star in Seattle, as a way to assert our governance as well in how did we come to our decision making. We came with potlatches, we feasted, and we discussed all the important issues that we're facing right now. And so on August 15th, 16th, and 17th, we'll be co-organizing with Anthony Fernandez and the warriors out in the Salish Sea, Port Angeles area, the path of the super tankers, to host this gathering. And we want to invite everybody out there and witness, because a lot of it, the governance takes place by the witnesses that are there to witness the work that's taking place and the declarations that are being formed. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanahus. Next up, we have Dana Nadine Scott. Just pulling up your bio here. Dana is a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto. She was appointed York Research Chair in Environmental Law and Justice in the Green Economy from 2018 to 2023. And she's one of the co-PIs of the Infrastructure Beyond Extractivism project, along with Professor Heidi Stark at the University of Victoria. Dana's talk is called Infrastructural Disentitlement, Coercive Dispossession on the Critical Minerals Frontier. Take it away.
Okay. Do you guys see my slides? Yep, my notes. Okay. Thanks so much. Sorry I was a little bit late. Thanks to Emma for putting this panel together, and Irina and Phil and Isaac for organizing us. It's really great to be able to hear everybody, and so I really wish we were in person in Chicago, if we didn't have to cross that border. Yeah, because it feels really good to hear what everyone's up to. So, what I want to talk about today is part of a larger book manuscript, which is called Fire in the Ring: Settler Law and Indigenous Jurisdiction on the Critical Minerals Frontier. But this particular section is one chapter in that book. It's now published in the Journal of Law and Political Economy, but I'm still working on the analysis as I continue the writing. And in fact, things are shifting in the new geopolitical context. And I think in part what we're seeing is this era of green extractivism that we thought we were entering, may now have just sort of reverted back to old extractivism. The sustainability aspect of what Theo Riafrancos was calling the security sustainability nexus in relation to critical minerals seems to have just been dropped, right? The pretext is dropped. This new kind of pragmatic transactionalism is taking hold, as politics is shifting far to the right, both in Canada and the US. So that new rationale that gave mining legitimacy over recent years, that it was crucial to our collective capacity to survive climate change, is replaced by the more frank admission that mining is central to economic domination and national defense. So the days in which net zero is needed to shield old economy extractivism from scrutiny may be over, but of course the pressure at the extractive frontier persists. I've been drawing on insights gained in community engaged research over about a decade with the leadership of Nishtantaka First Nation, which is a small Anishinaabe community in Treaty 9 in the heart of the area they call Ring of Fire in relation to mineral deposits. The work is collaborative. The aim is to be both kind of embedded and accountable. We work according to a sort of tentative and contingent solidarity on the basis of mutual aid principles. This is a picture of me talking with an elder in Nishtantaka, Maggie Sackany, in 2022, when I was invited to join a river trip on the Ottawapiskat to celebrate the community's launching of a new sturgeon stewardship program called Namekagagige, Many Sturgeon Forever, in Anishinaabemowin. And so this is the terrain of struggle. This is the Ottawapiskat River. And of course, on one view, it's a future mining district known as the Ring of Fire. And on the other, it remains part of the breathing lands, a vast unfragmented boreal peatlands supporting Indigenous lifeways. This is an outdated shot, but I like the way it shows Treaty 9, and the green shading is the boreal lowlands. At the bottom of the map is kind of the extent of the provincial highway network in Ontario. And so you can see that a great deal of distance has to be crossed in order to get minerals out of the Ring of Fire and onto trucks that can travel on a provincial highway. So that kind of line in red going up the middle of the map is where the proposed mining road to the Ring of Fire will essentially have to travel. And the river is at the center of the struggle. This is a quote by an elder, Peter Munias, who continues to make this same claim. In fact, on Monday, he'll be giving testimony to the Standing Committee on the Interior in Ontario on Bill 5, where I expect he will say a similar thing to the relevant ministers. And this is a map that Nessie did for us that is just showing the river in proximity to the Eagle's Nest mine, which is the most advanced project in the Ring of Fire, a proposed nickel mine. And you can also see that the proposed road route has been staked, and so it's showing up there as a mining claim on the map as well. So you can see the area in which the potential crossing around here. And so the crux of it is that Nishnantaga claims the Attawapiskat River as its homelands. And so crossing the Attawapiskat is unacceptable to them, and getting minerals out of the Ring of Fire is not viable without a road that crosses the Attawapiskat River. So just taking a step back as I was writing the book, it slowly dawned on me that it was impossible to separate all of the work being done on sort of the lands and resources portfolio with the ongoing social emergency on the ground in Nishnantaga. And so what I had been observing over about a decade, I came to characterize as a passive aggressive, coordinated tactics by state and industry that are aimed at gaining ground, that is, extending the extractive frontier. So the kind of crucial observation is that the community's capacity to defend its homelands is being undermined every day by the infrastructural deprivation and the sort of tactics around the access to infrastructure that state and company actors were taking. And I just want to acknowledge that this is like a very sensitive thing to talk about. It's a difficult argument to make without sort of repeating the deficit narratives that we all are familiar with. And so I want to just signal that I'm kind of open to correction if people feel it's just not appropriate the way I'm talking about it. I'm not trying to be callous, but I'm trying to be honest about what I'm seeing. And, I also want to say that, the people that have been lost in the amount of time I've been working with the community are people that are related to people that I have close relationships with now. So it isn't a really easy thing to confront, but I think it's important for us to see the dynamic as it's playing out. So here is just a couple of pictures to kind of get a sense of what it's like on the ground. This is one of the winter roads, the ice roads that is going into Yamatung, which is a neighboring community to Nishnantaga. They're bringing diesel, of course, to power the generators. The trucks are routinely going through the ice roads, the peat moss, because of climate change. So the length of time that those winter roads are open is shorter and shorter each year, which is part of what's making the desire for permanent road access so appealing to the communities that have decided to partner with government and industry. Of course, Nishnantaga has the longest running boil water advisory in Canada at 30 years now. That people started to articulate to me over the years this sense that the First Nation was losing membership and potentially losing its grip on the territory. As former Chief Munias said, quote, "Our buildings are old, decaying, and unsafe, and we have often several generations of family living together in crowded conditions. Over 200 of our members now live off reserve, not by choice, but because of a significant housing shortage." And then later in remarks to the UN Special Rapporteur, the former Chief Munias recounted a state of emergency due to a string of youth suicides in 2013, which they attributed specifically to the staggering infrastructure deficit, housing overcrowding, the boil water advisory, skin infections, mold, sewage backups, and a lack of mental health support, all are routine. And these conditions apply a persistent attritional pressure, pushing many members of the community to leave their homelands and usually settling in cities like Thunder Bay to the south. Thunder Bay, of course, is not kind to those that arrive from the remote communities, with deadly consequences for many Nishnantaga members in recent years, lives lost to racist violence, addiction, homelessness, etc. For the young people that have to leave the reserve to attend high school, the risks are also significant, as documented in Tanya Talaga's excellent book, 7 Fallen Feathers. So those that remain in the community on the land are struggling under the weight of managing the recurring crises. And it's here that I think anthropologist Tanya Lee's concept of letting die resonates. Lee argues that the extractive frontier expansion often entails a dynamic in which places or their resources are useful, but the people are not. Letting die is not an apocalypse, she says. It's not the kind of disaster that kills large numbers in a compressed period of time. It's a stealthy violence that consigns large numbers of people to live short and limited lives. Lee does not see letting die as a deliberate strategy. She sees it rather as a sign. Those who are let die have, quote, very limited relevance to capital at any scale. So following Lee's thesis, if community members in Nishnantika could position themselves as relevant to capital, as potential mine workers, road builders, gravel truck drivers, then perhaps they could reverse this trend of infrastructural decline. But instead, they position themselves as an impediment to capital accumulation. And so the community is ignored and its members are let die. Interestingly, Chief Bruce Achikpaniskum of Martin Falls First Nation, which is a road proponent, vigorously defends the community's pro-development stance based on the same dire need for infrastructure. He often mentions that the community of Martin Falls has sought the road connection to the provincial highway system for decades and takes the opportunity of the mineral deposit to get the community's connection. In September 2021, he stated, quote, "We have watched others enjoy the fruit of development while our community has languished in poverty and a perpetual lack of opportunity. It's impossible to change our circumstances without the proposed projects in the Ring of Fire. Without these projects, our community will continue to wither away. However, with these projects, we can inject hope in our community and plant the seeds for a brighter future." So I just want to point out that that is really the thing that the communities disagree on. That is at the heart of it. It is whether the circumstances are necessary, whether the projects are necessary for the brighter future or not. They don't disagree really about the obligations to protect the territory, the kind of desire to protect future generations, etc. And so my take on this is that Ontario did this. Ontario created this situation. And from it, we see, sure enough, that infrastructural entitlement has already started to materialize in Martin Falls. It's now a, quote, trusted partner of the province and the company because it's willing to move at the speed of business. It has new housing, a new youth complex, and a number of new buildings. The proponent community's enhanced entitlements to infrastructural investments from Ontario were formalized in 2024 with a community development aid agreement. However, this sense of conditionality or differential deprivation has obviously been attracting pushback at the community level. We have to confront the fact that none of this occurs in a context of resource scarcity. There are plenty of state funds that have been put towards building that critical minerals supply chain. There have been billions in subsidies for EV battery makers and their gigafactories. A $2 billion subsidy is provided for the road to the Ring of Fire, which is just a massive publicly funded de-risking of a privately held Australian mining company's foray into the Ring of Fire. And there's been the bankrolling of the environmental assessment that is now being completed by the two First Nations that have become the shadow proponents for the mining road. This private Australian company has also recently convinced the Ford government to completely exempt it from environmental assessment by way of a statute. That's Bill 5. So how it works. I'm saying basic infrastructural needs are denied and fulfilled to differential effect. Infrastructural disentitlement is passive. It's not necessarily deliberate or politically organized, but infrastructural entitlement is strategic and aggressive. And so you end up with a pattern where some places towards which resources are flowing and some out of which they're draining. And as I said, this chronic lack of community-focused infrastructure is undermining the community's capacity to defend their homelands to the benefit of settler state and extractive firms. And then the mechanics of dispossession, people are being forced off the land by the housing shortages, the lack of services, the drinking water. And there are some resonances here, I say in the paper, to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's theorization of organized state abandonment and Elizabeth Povinelli's economies of abandonment. In these conceptions, abandonment is a strategy of racial capitalist state formation. And similarly, Laurel Pulido's application of the lens of racial capitalism to the deadly drinking water crisis that afflicted Flint, Michigan in 2014, theorized the devaluation of the people of the predominantly Black city as, quote, based on both their Blackness and their surplus status, with the two being mutually constituted. So their abandonment, she argued, was accomplished through the shrinking infrastructure investment, which in that case resulted in deliberate poisoning. A reality, quote, reserved for those who are not only racially devalued, but considered incapable of contributing to accumulation. Processes of racialization reinforced through deficit narratives undeniably plays a role in rendering some people surplus and in mediating the flow of resources in and out of Treaty 9 today. As mentioned in my conception, infrastructural disentitlement is not deliberate or intentional as a strategy of elimination, but it is coordinated to differentially deprive. And the differential provision of infrastructural resources is undoubtedly racialized. So the reserve system itself is a remnant of explicit racial compartmentalization, of course, but also the free entry regime governing mineral staking on Indigenous territories is a blatant form of white possession. But the real thing I puzzled over in applying the racial capitalism lens to the dynamics in the Ring of Fire was the fact that similarly situated neighboring Anishinaabe communities of kin are treated differently, seemingly based solely on their ability to and willingness to engage with the extractivist vision and thus contribute to accumulation. So what can the theory of racial capitalism contribute to the analysis in such a context? Here, the differential provision of community-focused infrastructures may be the result of simple neglect, short-term thinking, or too little systematic attention. It may be operationalized simply through the reality of well-oiled connections moving faster, a form of regulatory capture in which communities with established lines of communication to state actors, because they've decided to partner with industry, work those contexts to meet their community's urgent needs. But even if it's not organized according to an obvious gradient of racialized distinction, infrastructural disentitlement is producing a differential politics of life, as Melanie Yazzie says. Is that you telling me I'm out of time, Irina? Yeah, okay. So this is the so-called corridor of prosperity that Ontario talks about. And yeah, there's just kind of one more point I want to make to finish the argument. It's the idea that, you know, in these contemporary liberal visions of a green economy, obviously Indigenous inclusion and economic reconciliation are now playing this sort of central role. And proponents are scrambling to partner with communities, and governments are kind of tripping over themselves to provide Indigenous loan guarantee programs. So in this legal and political context, it's the willingness of Indigenous communities to engage in accumulation that's crucial for legitimizing extraction. So this criteria of consent, which has been reduced to willingness to contribute to accumulation, however it is achieved, provides the basis on which to make the distinction between otherwise similarly situated communities. It breeds differential entitlement to the infrastructures necessary for survival, and thus it provides the heterogeneous conditions necessary for extractivist logics to function. And so I was just going to end on some talk about the vital infrastructures that in Nishtantaka they are working hard to take care of and to protect. And, you know, in the paper, I conclude this section by talking about the invasion of the extractive infrastructures, the decay of the community infrastructure, but the ongoing caretaking of the life-giving vital infrastructure that is the river, that people in Nishtantaka are collectively engaged in, and thinking about jurisdiction as being this set of collective practices that are undertaken to maintain life. Okay, thanks. Sorry for going over.
Thank you so much, Jana. I feel like corridor of prosperity is gonna haunt my dreams tonight. Horrifying expression. Our last panelist is Carlotta Chief. Carlotta Chief Dine is a University of Arizona Distinguished Outreach Faculty 2021 and a professor and extension specialist in environmental science at the University of Arizona. Dr. Chief works to bring relevant water science to Native American communities in a culturally sensitive manner. As director of the Indigenous Resilience Center, she aims to facilitate efforts of U Arizona climate and environment researchers, faculty, staff, and students working with Native nations to build resilience to climate impacts and environmental challenges. Carlotta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'll be talking about a just transition and land back for Navajos living within the Peabody Coal Company PWCC leasehold area. This is a project and effort that has been going on for over 50 years, but more recently led by Black Mesa United, which is a grassroots organization on the Navajo Nation, and funded by many different partners, including the Grand Canyon Trust, the Indigenous Resilience Center at the University of Arizona, the Native Peoples Design Coalition at the College of Agricultural Planning and Landscape at the University of Arizona, Yeha Alnido COVID Navajo Relief, Waverly Street Foundation, and the Agnes Nems Howery program. I am speaking on behalf of many people here today, and so want to acknowledge all of them. The Black Mesa United is a grassroots organization that was created as a result of the impacts of coal mining from the Peabody Coal Mine Company that was started mining on the Navajo Nation in 1964. And there was a lot of impacts from this coal mine, and the Black Mesa United mission was to advocate for the people within those living in the coal company leasehold area and represented by 6 sectors. And the reason was to support a just transition, to advocate for the people, and to promote economic and social and educational advancement of the people who continue to live on the Peabody coal leasehold area. And there are the mine, Kieta Mine and Black Mesa Mine has closed and it's currently undergoing reclamation. And the people continue to advocate and fight for land back and just transition where there is a lack of voice. The 6 sectors living within the leasehold area are fragmented amongst 5 Navajo Nation chapters, government chapters, which act like similar to city council, and they are located 27 to 50 miles away. And the Black Mesa residents don't make a majority of any of these chapters, and so it makes it difficult to voice the needs. Black Mesa is located in the southwestern United States in northeastern Arizona, and it is located on a plateau 45 miles by 55 miles wide. And it is a homeland for the Navajo people with beautiful tall pine and aspen trees, lush with rare plants and species. Black Mesa has supported the Diné livelihood for time immemorial, and the Diné people rely on springs and groundwaters to support their livelihoods that include ranching, raising sheep, cattle, and horses, doing farming such as corn that have been passed down through generations, and teaching to the next generation. It's a matriarchal Dene society that is really rooted deeply in language and connecting to family livelihoods and land and air. And the most people still engage in this livelihood. They've been impacted by the coal mining, but still live in the leasehold area. And there's been forced relocation, but no just compensation. Either people have to move around the mining activities, or they are given homes, or a few have been given homes that were not built correctly. And then because of the explosions of the land surf mining, that also impacts the integrity of the home itself. So because of the mining so closely located, there's a lot of respiratory diseases, health impacts, bioaccumulation in livestock and animals, as well as environmental impacts that are seen. This is all documented by citizen scientists, impacts to water, land, and soil that have resulted in wide range of livestock death. But meanwhile, all of this during the mining, the coal was mined to produce electricity for big cities such as Vegas, Phoenix, and LA. But yet the people there living in the leasehold area are not able to develop anything. And so they have no running water, no electricity, and they are required to haul water. So when the Peabody closed in 2005 and 2019, they're currently decommissioning and reclaiming the mines to return the lands back to the Navajo and Hopi tribes. And so BMU is actively involved in making sure Peabody is properly reclaiming the lands, partnering with Tonajonah Ane to stay informed. But the people ask, what is going to be left for the people? What are they leaving for the residents? And this is a photo of what's going on right now as they decommission and remove infrastructure. And the question for over 25 years since this started was, what is going to be left for the people? And this includes all the water and electrical infrastructure that Peabody was using that they're getting ready to take down, but can they leave those for the people? In Jonathan Ned's administration, former president of the Navajo Nation, he signed the MOU with President Biden talking about just transition. And so Black Mesa United has been advocating and vocal on this, being involved in the interagency working group on coal and power plant communications and economic revitalization. The Black Mesa is not the only coal community on the Navajo Nation. This map shows all the coal communities on the Navajo Nation that are dealing with similar things. So as a result of this activities and the advocacy of Black Mesa, they applied for funding through the University of Arizona Indigenous Resilience Center, and also received funds from the Grand Canyon Trust Just Transition to work on updating a land use plan that was for just transition that was developed in 2005. And they received support in last year, 2024, by Navajo Nation President Lou Nygren, who said, "I'm committed to just transition for the Navajo residents living in and around the Peabody coal leasehold area." And so within a year, as a result of the funding from the Indigenous Resilience Center and the Grand Canyon Trust, they have worked on a lot of workshops, surveys to update this just transition plan entitled Integrating Restoration, Conservation, and Growth in a Sustainable Post-Mine Zithagene Land Use Plan within the Peabody leasehold area. and they did a household survey to quantify the impacts. There has never been a study on all of these impacts in a quantitative manner. And so a lot of it's just being done by the residents themselves, leaders within the sectors, many who are elders going home to home, quantifying all this impact so that they could ask for resources. For over 30 years, the residents living within the Peabody leasehold area have not had any place to convene. Um, Initially, back in the 60s, the Peabody did allow them to use a warehouse to convene. However, that was torn down. And then Ned Yazzie, who's an elder, donated his land to do community development. But due to some internal community conflict, that project was terminated. Then it turned into applying for ARPA warehouse funds that Navajo Nation didn't fund. And then most recently is an effort on the Black Mesa Community Hub, which is to acquire a building. And because the residents do not have any place to operate or to do any kind of educational, social health advancement and obtain services. So they put in a letter of interest for this Peabody building, which was formerly an engineering building that's located there. And they would like to renovate this building to turn it into a community resilience hub. So they submitted a letter of interest in January 2024, and they received support by the Navajo Nation president to begin to plan to renovate this building. There are no funds that are coming from the Navajo Nation at a larger level. However, the local chapter of the Kayenta government chapter has committed to devoting the royalty funds that they received. So BMU is currently working with them to designate $300,000 of that royalty funds to this community resilience hub. And so the Black Mesa United has been meeting with the Indian Health Service and the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority to talk about the water infrastructure and the electrical lines and how they can retrofit this into community resilience hub. In addition, the Native Peoples Design Coalition at the University of Arizona, funded by the Howry program, started to do workshops this past spring to do community design to see how that building can be retrofitted. They looked at the needs, priorities of the people, what they need. Not everything can be housed here, but they took the top priority and are currently developing a conceptual design of this to redesign it. And so the community is really excited on that. At the same time that this is going on, that's community driven. There are, ongoing right now bond release application by Peabody to acquire back their funds, bonds that are in these various mutual, these fund like Zurich, American Liberty Mutual, Darius Point, Goldman Sachs, to release $107 million. And in 2024 alone, Peabody achieved a company record of $110 million in bond release. And they have reported $4 billion in revenue. And all this money coming to Peabody, and the grassroots just trying to get, hundreds of thousands just to retrofit a building. In addition, recent news of the Navajo Nation president who is reinvigorating coal on the Navajo Nation. And working with President Trump on executive orders to support coal development. And there's a public hearing by the Navajo Nation Council on May 30th. In addition, these executive orders have impacted universities, particularly the Indigenous Resilience Center, who does a lot of environmental justice, environmental resilience with tribes, has lost $1.1 million in the last 3 months, working on Native Youth Alliance, technical assistance. And so there's a lot of things going on right now on all those national, state and community level that makes it a very wicked problem, a complex problem. But moving forward, the community at Black Mesa United is very collaborative, very positive and moving forward to try to figure out what they can do. They're continuing to do the land back withdrawal application with the Navajo Nation that was submitted on February 11th. Although they applied for the EPA Community Change Grant, which was dismantled through the Inflation Reduction Act. They'll redirect that to apply for EPA Brownsville grant in November, continuing to work with the Native Peoples Design Coalition and the Kayenta chapter. Although Black Mesa residents have experienced severe environmental injustice through the last 60 years, they continue to work to honor our ancestors in building a sustainable livelihood for future generations. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this work and to be part of this group as well. And please feel free to visit these websites, email us, watch the documentary video, and please reach out if you're interested in helping. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carletta. Just some really, again, more sort of beautiful examples of resilience on the ground coming through in a number of these talks. We have about just around 20 minutes left in today's conversation. I maybe want to just pull some themes out just really, really quickly. And then I wanted to start by giving the panelists a chance to respond to one another or to ask each other questions if anyone had comments or questions for one another. I'd also encourage folks listening to drop any questions or comments they have in the Q&A function. We can get to those after. Again, one thing that really jumped out at me through all 5 presentations today is sort of a real kind of praxis of land back, or praxis even of law back, like a sort of real combination of theory and practice coming together. And I feel like a number of folks really touched on this idea of how settler law, in so-called Canada and so-called the US, is being expanded and reimagined, even when the law pushes back on those attempts, right? So Section 35 says, no, you can't do that with the Constitution. The government comes back and says, no, you need a covenant to do this unnecessarily. I sort of have this image in my head of the tiny houses on wheels kind of rolling away from settler law as it chases them around Secwepemc territory. So I think there's a real sort of push and pull here that we're seeing. I think some people resist in really important ways. That was sort of the overwhelming thing I took out, but I think we could also draw other connections. But given the amount of time we have, I did want to turn it back over to you to see again if people had comments for one another, or if we have any questions from the audience. So the floor is currently open. I'm not seeing any questions from the audience yet. No one. Well, in that case, let me ask, because one of the Rob, go ahead.
I could ask a question. I mean, it's odd for me as a presenter to ask a question, but I might as well. Um, I was curious because one thing that I've been, so this is a question for Dana, I suppose. Because one thing that I've been, as you know, Dana was on my committee for my PhD, so she knows that I spent a fair amount of time thinking about capitalism and the way that it works. But something that I missed or didn't quite get to in that was thinking about racial capitalism or colonial racial capitalism. And so I've been meaning to, and I've been starting to try and read a little bit more in that area and to think about the ways in which it is helpful or fits or doesn't with the types of critiques and projects that I do. So, I mean, I don't need to, since Dana, you know generally what I do, I don't need to expand on it too much, but I guess I just wondered a little bit more about how much you've been exploring around that area and how helpful you find it in I know you touched on it, but maybe just a little more, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. I I mean, I haven't read a lot of the, I guess, primary texts. I kind of live with a person who's kind of breathed that stuff for a while, and I absorbed some of it, I think. But I, I really just was puzzling over because when I do the pieces that I have read, I do. I think I find it has like a lot of explanatory power in terms of the world we see around us generally. But I was really having a hard time like figuring out how the lens could explain the kind of differential entitlements that I was seeing that were, they couldn't follow like an obvious kind of racial gradient in terms of how different communities were being positioned differently. And maybe for, people who work on the political economy of settler colonialism, that's just kind of beside the point. It's like, of course, consent to contribute to accumulation is the criterion on which the differential, effect will be grounded, and therefore, an extractivist logic can kind of take hold, right? Because this idea that extractivist logics, like capitalist logics, generally need that distinction or differentiate on, right? So it was kind of like an experiment in trying to figure out if I could kind of make that literature or use that literature to help make sense of what was going on there. And I think it did kind of help sharpen the way in which that distinction has to be made in order to enable differential entitlement, and for extraction to kind of take hold. But it's not a really a perfect fit, I guess, is what I was saying. I don't know if other people have thoughts on this. I'm curious because I know lots of people on this call know this literature. So, but thanks for asking that, Rob.
Oh, Sherry, go ahead.
I want to thank the panelists. That was so interesting. Maybe people are quiet because we're just absorbing a lot of information. I mean, I think I just really learned a lot about these vast differences in these sort of land back projects based on, the particular situation of nations and their governance traditions. And I think I'm just sitting with that and really thinking about it, like across Rob and Canahus's presentations and Carletta's incredible work and Jocelyn and Emma's just really powerful navigation of Section 35 with the Tzilchotin. It's really interesting. But just to pick up on this conversation here, I mean, I have I do have a couple thoughts. One is just sort of questioning the framework of like infrastructural disentitlement. Like the work that I've done on funding formulas really shows that, when I completely understand why you frame this as like a not deliberate but coordinated affect of systemic impoverishment and how it leads to extraction, because you don't have to be that conspiratorial. Like Canahus's dad was like, Art was always telling us, like, don't get too fancy about this stuff. Like, just look what's happening. Look at the land percentages for Indigenous people versus white people and non-Indigenous people. And there's your political economy, right? Like 0.2% reserves. That's going to tell you why some people have political power and some people do not. But I do think like you can overstate that a bit, because I looked really closely at all the funding formulas around water and housing, and there have been studies for decades that show that the funding formulas don't keep up with need. So there's also a form of there's also a lack of accountability that can come with overreaching on like the indeterminate relationship between those things too, because then why isn't there political will for the boil water advisory to be lifted at Niskandiga? I don't know if there's a direct answer to that question, but there's a direct set of data you can point to that ensures that no one can be off the hook for that relationship between systemic impoverishment and resource extraction and bullying, to accept resource extraction as the only form of infrastructural capacity building on reserves, right? And then on the question of racial capitalism, I think racial capitalism is also sort of overstated as a distinct framework from analysis of capitalism. Like, we know that all capitalism is going to grind on the wheel of difference. That's how it creates a sense of narrative for why some people are poor and some people are rich in very rich societies. But I think for colonization, racial capitalism also gives us, or capitalism in general gives us this, for me, it gives us this framework of why sometimes the state says that they really want Indigenous people to assimilate, and why sometimes the state says we're going to erect all these barriers so that they can't. There's always this paradox around, there always has been with the Indian Act. It's oh, we want them to assimilate. It's well, why then are there separate laws for who can sell food on the market and who cannot? There's obviously an internal threat that's always it's always the lie and the contradiction of assimilation. And it seems similar with communities who accept extraction and reject extraction. You can sort of line it up along this strategy of partition versus assimilation. And it's kind of like a flexible mechanism for keeping people in line and policing them into compliance. It's through that dependency, then you can really pull the strings pretty hard. Anyway, so those are my thoughts about it, but I just really appreciated everyone's presentations. They were amazing, and really impressive work.
Thanks, Yuri. That point about accountability it's really useful. I think yeah.
I was thinking as you finished speaking of the sort of metaphor that we heard in the first presentation about how, under Section 35, you can have a right to the thing, but you can't have the right to manage or make decisions about the thing. And to me, that's sort of a related idea that once you get to a question of where the scale of a resurgent infrastructure is actually large enough to disrupt markets, to disrupt lines of authority, that's when the state has to step in.
Interesting.
Because I think a lot of the projects that we heard about today are actually operating at a scale that is really ambitious, and often something that is really hard to get to. I was sort of thinking as Rob was talking that you're actually talking about a fair amount of land, right? It's sort of the postage stamp that the courts talk about, but it does actually add up to something. And I think and kind of who's made that point, I think even more strongly, talking about, well, what if you look at all the sort of little 0.2%? What could they add up to?
I have a question if no one else is jumping in on that. For Jocelyn and Emma, I wonder if you want to say anything more about this puzzle of trying to fit jurisdiction into the right, or if you've done some strategizing about how you could maybe get in on that and then leverage it out again at some point.
Jocelyn, do you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the way that this was posed to us, I do think was like drawing on sort of the protective elements of Section 35, right? Like, what if somebody gets arrested? Are we going to be able to defend them? And so so that's that's still sort of there as part of the motivation for doing this work. But I do think we're trying to sort of figure out, like, as we pointed out in the presentation, what you're picking up on, Dana, like, is there a different way for sort of like shifting the paradigm around Section 35? I guess we're kind of encouraged by that Montour decision. Um, but like, I think it's even if you even if you sort of look at the strongest cases of Section 35, like in terms of like where the courts have sort of clearly found protected rights, like what that translates into on the ground is like not that is it's not very promising, right? Um, so I mean, from a practical perspective, I mean, Emma, you can jump in with your thoughts, right? But like from a practical perspective, I do think we're just trying to kind of get the nation in a position where they can really advance some negotiations and keep pushing the boundaries on the ground, like at the same time as having having something in their back pocket in case, I don't know, conservative government does get elected here and the climate changes and we do start to see arrests around fire again, but which doesn't seem like it's the case at this particular moment. But so like I think at this point it's like been very much motivated from a practical perspective. Um, and the concept, like I haven't done that hard work of sort of conceptual sort of thinking around Section 35 yet. The leveraging is like purely sort of pragmatic on the ground. How's this going to help the nation? What about you, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dana, like, that's the thing is like we're exactly at this moment where we are figuring out what the strategy is. And it feels like this sort of double barrel thing where we need to come in and be able to say that cultural burning does meet the existing crappy test of Section 35. Um, but also with roll into that a critique of the existing crappy test and talk about the possibilities of what a better test might do to better um, I was going to say accommodate, but accommodate is absolutely the wrong word, but like better just relate to questions of jurisdiction, support questions of jurisdiction, not necessarily shoehorn jurisdiction in, but shoehorn a section 35 in a new way so that it vis-a-vis jurisdiction. And so we're like very much in that like strategy mode that you're talking about, Dana, and like so seeking input if anybody on this call has any ideas. But also because we have seen, even though, as Jocelyn just said, like people aren't getting arrested, but we have seen a clampdown of on the burning, in that the province has reacted very aggressively to fires that leave the tidal lands. And so I was actually thinking about and Rob's presentation about this sort of like patchwork of land back and how that creates a kind of jurisdictional patchwork where you have different kinds of jurisdictional restrictions depending on how you get your land back. And watching the province do this kind of like containment exercise, where a fire cannot be contained to, you know, tidal lands versus crown lands, but containing Tsilhqot'in jurisdiction to tidal lands versus crown lands. And so trying to make an argument that escapes those kinds of clampdowns and this kind of jurisdictional patchwork where you're dealing with
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question because it's also sort of a patchwork between various um, First Nations or Indian Act bands that sometimes do and sometimes don't work together as a collective, right? So it's like we tend to sort of go in and out of um, coming together to like work across our territories and sometimes pulling into being that, no, this is Sayout or Surlip or Sycom territory and that piece is our piece and so forth. So the way in which you might be able to have Saanich law work across those things is not only kind of the patchwork of land in and of itself, but also the patchwork of people who, or people or entities, or I don't know, whatever, like who gets to speak it, I guess, is also sort of a patchwork too. So it's, um, we have various things to try and pull some of that together, but it comes and goes. So, yeah, I don't know. Big question, I guess, lots to think through. And I don't know, like I said, I have 0 words written on it. So, but it's a good thing to think about.
Get the transcript. Then you'll have already a whole bunch of words written on this.
Yeah.
We can all send you our notes that we were jotting, that we were scribbling down.
Perfect.
Some more words. We're actually at time, and I think that's maybe a beautiful note to leave it at. Yeah, I really echo what Sherry said. I think I'm still digesting a lot of what was said, but I found it really, really powerful. So thank you to all 6 of our panelists. Thank you to Isaac for making all the technology work, and thank you especially to the folks who stuck around to the very end. The 16 or so of you. We really appreciate you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.